Hey everyone, Pastor Caleb here with another daily devotion. We're into Deuteronomy 7 today. Deuteronomy 7, we're going to take in one small chunk and one big chunk. There's a whole lot packed into the first couple verses, and there's obviously a lot in the other verses too, but they are all kind of on the same theme, and so I want to take this as thematically as possible. So we're actually just going to do the first couple verses of chapter 7, but tomorrow we're going to finish up chapter 7 and get a whole big picture of this chapter and put all the pieces together. So make sure you don't miss both of these daily devotions. I'm going to read the text. We're just going to read 4 verses. If you want to follow along, the text is in the description of the video or description of the podcast. Moses writes, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you." Okay, so we have this theme right at the beginning of God driving out the nations from the promised land. And there are frankly a lot of people who are really uncomfortable with this idea. In fact, if you were to go on, blogs or YouTube videos that talk about criticisms against Christianity or criticisms against the Bible, one of the things that is almost always lobbed across the bow is this idea of the Old Testament violent God who, in many ways, you could say this is almost like genocide, right? He's taking out an entire people group just because they're in the way of the nation of Israel. So what do we say about that? I think the first thing we have to say is the only reason we're bothered by that is because we are modern Western people who believe everybody should be judged individually and not as part of a group. And that just frankly is not how most of the world thinks of themselves, and it's not how the Bible thinks of people. God thinks of people, yes, as individuals, and he judges people for their sins according to their own individual sins. However, our humanness is connected to other humans. Like I've said multiple times, we are a product of the DNA of our mother and our father together. We are, in effect, an extension of them, and our children are extensions of us. There's a reason you love your kids more than you love my kids, because they are actually sort of you, just in a different form, a new person that's come together because of the relationship you have with your spouse. And so if we understand humanity in a very collective way, and then we understand all these people are connected, then we can understand why God would take out an entire people group. These people groups, these are not all the nations that the nation of Israel drove out from the promised land, but these ones particularly are ones that are sort of exemplary of the type of people who were in the promised land. And they were all types of people who, even though maybe not everyone in their nation participated in this stuff, they were into some really dark things. For example, like the idea of sacrificing children to their gods, like where they would take, for example, with Molech, who's one of the gods, he would be a form of a bull that would be heated up by having a fire underneath him, his iron statue, and then on his hands, which were now, essentially as hot as the burners or even hotter on your stove, they would place their babies on his hands, and they would, of course, die from burns, and that was part of their worship, and that's that nation. And so God connects the entirety of that nation to that behavior, because really nobody's stopping it, right? Even if you are complicit in that action, it's your nation, it's your people, it's the people you're connected to, and you're not doing anything about it. Now, this has massive implications for us as we just think about sin, and we'll get back to the idea of God driving out the nations in a second, but let's just think about this for ourselves and what this means for us. First of all, in our actual nation, are we complicit in the evil that is happening around us because we say, that's just the way of the world? I don't think that's okay. Like, God would say, you, even if you are not participating in the evils of the world that you are a part of, the nation that you're a part of, you are still in a corporate way guilty for that. And you can buck against that and say, well, I'm a modern person, I don't believe in that. Okay, doesn't mean it's not true, right? So if you see things that are happening in the world, like, whatever your evil that you see, if you see abortion, or you see poverty, or you see injustice, or you see all sorts of things that are happening, and you're not doing anything about those things, I mean, you're as complicit as those people, just as much worthy of the destruction that God would bring against people who are evil. And I think Christians are going to feel really surprised as they start to see destruction come on our nation. Now, I'm not saying God is doing the same thing to the United States or to Canada that he did here to the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites, but the way that God created the world is to work in such a way that if the world is rebelled against, its natural order is rebelled against in sin, then it's just going to fall apart. And so nations that are built maybe on what we call Christian principles are just going to function better. Even if the people are not necessarily Christian, if they're operating in line with the way God has created the world to work, it's just going to function better. But as soon as you start going off the rails, your nation falls apart, just kind of the way it is. Okay, so first of all, let's think about that. Then let's also think about in our church communities. Are we seeing other people's sin as something we just sort of, hope it's going to get fixed, or hope the pastor is going to deal with it, or hope that, maybe it's going to get better over time? We can't do that. Christians call each other out for their sins. And if you have a Christian who is in your congregation, you call them out for their sins, and they're a real jerk about it, I mean, frankly, maybe they're not a Christian, and maybe they needed to be exposed as not a Christian so that either they would repent or they would go to where they were actually intending to go before, which was away from God, and just use God for the idea of some sort of comfort that's going to cover over the fact that they really just want to keep on sinning. So Christians, let's do that. We're scared of that because we're scared, if we, call those people out for their sins, then they might leave and they might, deplete our numbers in our church, or we might lose offerings or something like this. Man, can God not take over and fix those things for us? Let's be faithful to what he has called us to, which is to call people out for their sin, and also to be willing to be called out for our sin, because we are a unit. Yes, we are individuals, but we are also collective, and that can't be lost on us. So why does God drive out these nations? Well, they are nations that are doing evil. And the very fact that God saves any nation, considering the sinfulness that is in all mankind, is amazing. Now, God obviously didn't save Israel just because they were Israelites. He saved them through faith in the promise of the Messiah. And in the same way, he's not going to save Canada or the United States or any country because it's a quote-unquote Christian nation. He's going to save the people in that nation who have faith in Jesus, which is you, I hope, as you watch this, and me, and that means that, I'm going to be a force for good in this nation, hopefully. But my nation itself is not something that God is going to save or not save. It's all about faith for him. So I hope that answers the idea. God wiping out entire nations is completely within his rights. They have sinned against him. He is God. It's just. Sin deserves death and hell. And so the very fact that he gave them any time at all and didn't destroy them before that is a grace of his. And people will say, well, why didn't he want to share the gospel with them? Why didn't he want the Israelites to connect with them and share that message of the Messiah who was coming with them? Again, I think that's trying to look into the mind of God. But remember, God did have all those nations come from Noah and Adam originally. And so the promises that were given to Noah were passed on to his sons. And from there, evil men led their families away from the promises. And eventually the third and fourth generation of those who hated God suffered the consequences. And if that bothers you, go fix it, right? Like there are people in the world right now who are not hearing the gospel because their fathers decided to block the gospel in some way. You can go there and find them and share that gospel with them. Now, if you're part of my congregation, for example, you do that first and foremost with your offerings every Sunday. We give some of the offerings that we receive as a congregation to our church body, which allows us to send missionaries to places where the gospel is not being preached. But maybe you could figure out a way to do that in our community. I mean, you don't have to go to Africa or Asia to find people who haven't heard the gospel. There are people who haven't heard the gospel in Mississauga. You could find those people. Let's work on that together. Okay, so then he says, well, once you drive these nations out, make sure that you completely defeat them, totally destroy them, don't leave anything behind. Now, we're going to talk a little bit next time about idolatry and how we need to crush our idols and we need to eliminate idols from our life. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but just see the completeness of this. God is not letting two religions exist at the same time. He says, you worship me, and that's it. Nothing else. Everything else needs to come in some sort of far second. There can't be this idea of holding in balance. Well, I have my God stuff and I have my this thing. And I try to, keep some tension there. No, overwhelmingly, your life is spent in worship to God. Then one more thing from the section we want to pull out, and that's the do not intermarry with them, or they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. So the idea of intermarrying is something that people wrestle with, especially in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul talks about this in more depth in 1 Corinthians 7, when he talks about single people and people who are married to people who are unbelievers and so on. And so there's a lot of nuance to that, and maybe I'll go into that just very briefly. But what we have to be willing to say is that the Bible is very clear. You should not marry someone who is not a believer. And I'm realizing that as soon as I say that, like maybe some of you who possibly are married to an unbeliever or have family members who are married to an unbeliever, like your ears perk up, your spine tingles a little bit, the hairs on the back of your neck stands up because you don't like that. So let me massage this idea into your mind. The reason we don't like that idea, I think, is because when we marry somebody, there's no going back from it, right? Because God says he hates divorce. And so once you're married to somebody, stay married to them. And Apostle Paul says this too. If you're married to an unbeliever, stay married to them. That doesn't mean, though, that the act of marrying them in the first place was not a bad idea. It was a bad idea. It was against what God explicitly commands here. And in the New Testament, he also talks about it. Don't be unequally yoked, he says in Corinthians. And the fact that we can't go back and change it, I think bugs us because deep down inside, we want to be self-justifiers. We want to be able to fix the evil that we've done so that, yeah, we can receive God's grace, but then I got to fix it so that I can feel better about the fact that I rid my own life of sin. No, like the gospel is, God rid your life of sin in putting your sin on Jesus Christ on the cross. You are free from it. It is over. Now, you may be living in a less than ideal situation, married to somebody who is not sharing your faith with you. And that doesn't mean that the act itself in the first place was not sin, but man, like that's gone. It's over. Live at peace, right? And as the scripture says, if you're living with somebody who is not in faith with you, then live in such a way to show them the characteristics of somebody who believes in the gospel, who is generous and gracious and patient and kind and all these things, so that they might actually end up believing. Now, I want you to expand this idea, though, to a bigger sphere, and that is the idea of my sin and the guilt that I feel over my sin. When something is done, we feel guilty about it. The very fact that we try to hide it from God or from friends or family members, spouses, whatever, is us holding on to the ability, at least we believe, to go back and somehow fix it, to go back and somehow make it right, to go back and somehow make it not be true or not exist. That is a sinful impulse. That is me trying to deal with my own sin. The gospel is hard to believe for the sinful heart, but the gospel says that sin is paid for completely. God has forgotten about it. He has pushed it out of his mind as far as the east is from the west. And therefore, God is not going to hold you accountable for that sin, since it's on Jesus. And the Christian church ought not to hold you accountable for that sin. And if they do, they're not acting like Christians. Christians give grace liberally to people. So if you're feeling guilt over a sin that's in your past and you haven't confessed it to, well, God first and foremost, but then to your pastor or to your friend or to your, whoever you sinned against, or to a spouse, a brother, sister, whatever the case may be, like do that. Bring it out into the light, because holding on to it is holding on to your, at least perceived, right to fix it. And Christ has already fixed it. The only person holding on to your guilt is you, and you're tearing yourself up doing it. Don't let that happen. Now, one more thing I want to say about intermarriage, and that is that we ought to train our young people to think about marriage in the context of their faith. We tend to think love comes first, fall in love with somebody and then we'll worry about the faith thing. No, faith comes first. I will go as far to say to my daughters, if a person is not a Lutheran, you are not allowed to become boyfriend and girlfriend with them, because that is the path to marriage. And if they're not a Christian, they're not a Lutheran particularly, you don't want to marry them. And obviously, I can't force my daughters to do things. They might sin, and that's a sad thing. But I'm going to talk about it in the context of their faith. Say, this is what your Bible says. Your God says this to you. Take this seriously. The other thing we need to do is crucify the idol of love. And I'll talk a little bit about this more tomorrow, but the idea that love has to be at the center of our relationships, like the feeling of love, the butterflies of love have to be at the center of our relationships, that is an idolatry. When God talks about love, he says it's sacrifice for another person that you don't necessarily like or maybe don't want to serve or sacrifice for. That's love, because that's what Jesus did for us. Love had no greater man than this, than he laid down his life for his friends. Love is patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness. It does not keep records of wrongs. It is not easily angered, but delights in the truth. That's real love. It's not a feeling, it's an action. And you can give that to a lot of people in this world. Now, of course, I'd love to talk more about how you find a good Christian spouse, but let's just put it at this. When you're looking for a Christian spouse, find someone who is going to exemplify the characteristics of love that 1 Corinthians 13 has, that Jesus has, and then worry about actually feeling the feelings of love for them later. That may seem counterintuitive. That's because you're a North American, but that's actually how God calls us to live. So hopefully this is helpful for you. A couple deep topics. We got some more to talk about with idolatry next time, so I hope you join me. If you like what you're seeing, like and subscribe to this channel. Make sure you share the content so other people can see it. And if you want to keep watching something, you can click on the links that are on the screen right now on YouTube, and you can find something else. I'll talk to you soon.